tuned until the end when we announce the 4 winners of Professor Brumfield's book, Architecture at the End of the Earth. We are so fortunate to have one of the world's foremost experts on Russia with us tonight to offer a historical perspective on the catastrophic situation caused by the invasion of Ukraine. Professor Brumfield will discuss certain deeply rooted cultural attitudes that provide a context for Russian hostility toward Western values, as well as the ramifications of that hostility for the current crisis. Professor Brumfield is a professor of Slavic Studies and the Seisler Professor of Jewish Studies at Tulane, a recipient of the 2000 John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Fellowship, and a fellow at the National Humanities Center. In December 2019, Professor Brumfield's nearly 50 years of work and dedication to the betterment of relations with the Russian Federation and its people were recognized when he was presented with the Order of Friendship Medal, the highest state decoration of the Russian Federation given to foreign nationals. Please join me in welcoming Professor Brumfield.
To be taking a tour of Russia from St. Petersburg to Moscow this summer. That had been advertised, as many of you know, and shortly thereafter, the terrible catastrophic invasion of Ukraine occurred. Nonetheless, we persevere. And tonight, I would like to give you some idea of the richness of Ukrainian culture and its architectural heritage, and a survey of its history before we move to current events. I'd like to begin by reading you a quote. "We have become Europeans," we meaning Russians, "have become Europeans under the inescapable condition of disrespect for ourselves." Further, if I can go back and find the quote, then we shall continue. I think you will find this of interest. We have always yielded our interest to those of Europe. But how has Europe repaid us? Nothing but disrespect for us and for our values. Now, these words were not written or spoken by the current leadership of Russia. They were written by Fyodor Dostoevsky in the 1870s. One of the greatest writers of world literature, known and beloved by all of us for his great novels. And yet, he who had traveled so often in Europe, his first 2 children were born in what is now Germany, who knew European philosophy and literature, French, German, English. Yet in his writings, particularly toward the end of his career, there's this sense of grievance, of being disrespected, of being excluded from Europe's orbit. How can one reconcile these striking divergences? Shall we say, the perception of the world on one hand and fear of that world on another. We'll return to this dichotomy toward the end of my talk when we discuss current events and the current situation, catastrophic situation, because of the invasion of Ukraine. But now I would like to show you something of the richness of Ukrainian culture. I am, after all, not a political scientist. I am a cultural historian, a historian of architecture, and a photographer. And I'd like to show you some of the photographs that I've taken of Ukraine's great monuments of architecture. And we'll go to the history after this brief slideshow. We'll start off with the central cathedral of Kiev. And this, hopefully we will get the slide advance. The Cathedral of the Divine Sophia, built in the first half of the 12th century. And if I could have the slideshow advance. Yes, built in the first half of the 11th century. The Eastern Slavs had accepted Christianity through their ruler of Kiev, Prince Vladimir. In 988, the generally accepted date for the Christianization of Rus. And at that time, there was no such thing as Russia or Ukraine or Belarus. It was just a general territory settled by the Eastern Slavs. Kiev became its center, as we will again return to next in our history to follow. But here's the great cathedral of Saint Sophia, named, of course, in honor of the main shrine of Constantinople, the 6th century Cathedral of Divine Wisdom, or Saint Sophia, in Constantinople, built during the reign of Emperor Justinian. So Kiev, having accepted Christianity and having invited Greek architects and clerics to their lands, began to create works of art and architecture that were based on Byzantium, Constantinople, particularly of the Middle Byzantine period. This is one of the greatest. It was rebuilt, it was sacked, and on various occasions during the 18th century, it acquired its Baroque domes. But you still see the apse where the main altar is, with the original brickwork, opus mixtum brickwork. And then we go to another shrine in Kiev, the Monastery of the Caves, considered the founding monastery of Orthodox Christianity among the Eastern Slavs. And we're viewing here photographs that I took in November of 1979. Here we overlook the churches and the bell towers and the gate church of the lower cave ensemble. In the setting sun, these golden domes recreated in the 18th century, one of the central sites of spirituality in what was known as Rus, Kievan Rus, R-U-S, which extends from about the late 9th century until the Mongol invasion of 1240, which we will return to in just a minute. Now, here you see the churches that I photographed in pristine condition as they looked in the 18th century, but in the same monastery. When I was there in November 1979, they were only the ruins of the central monastic cathedral. It was blown up. There are competing versions, whether it was blown up by the German occupation, or whether it was a casualty of Russian partisan warfare. But it was blown up in the late fall of 1941, and its ruins and the parts of its walls were all that were left when I saw it in 1979. The Cathedral of the Dormition of Mary, Mother of God. That cathedral in the 1990s was completely rebuilt, incorporating the fragments of the original walls, which you see here in my photograph. Here is another view, if we can advance the slide. Yes, here it is, of the monastery bell tower, built in the middle of the 18th century to a plan by Johann Schädel, seen through the ruins of the east part of the great Dormition Cathedral, which I remind you was rebuilt in the 1990s when Ukraine had become an independent nation and the monastery was restored to activity. But when I saw it and I photographed it, the bell tower stood amid the ruins of the German occupation. Or the cathedral of St. Cyril Monastery. This is late 11th century. It was frequently rebuilt. We see here its Baroque appearance because this area was under Polish control. In fact, a number of the Orthodox churches were converted to Catholic churches. And that was reflected in the decoration on the exterior. But here we see the monastery church, the cathedral of St. Cyril Monastery, built in its present, in its original structure. Then the walls are still preserved under this decoration in the mid-12th century. Or we could go to the Widubiecki Monastery on the outskirts of Kiev, which did survive. It has 11th century church. But what you see here is the bell tower with its own church, and the the Church of St. George, built at the turn of the 18th century in a form that would be known as Ukrainian or Cossack Baroque. There is a close-up view of the Church of St. George, built at the turn of the 18th century at the Widubiecki Monastery, with these four lobes coming out from the center, the central dome. This is a beautiful example of Ukrainian Baroque, late 17th century Baroque. Interesting enough, you can see churches that look like this in Western Siberia, because Peter the Great esteemed the prelates of the Ukrainian church and sent them to his new domains that he's colonizing in Western Siberia. Naturally, the churches there followed what had been practiced in the turn of the 18th century, the time of Peter the Great, in Kiev and Ukraine. Another example from the Baroque, built by the architect who built the Winter Palace, now the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, one of the greatest Baroque architects of Europe, Francesco Bartolomeo Rastrelli. This is the Church of St. Andrew, built on a cliff in the center of Kiev. Splendid photograph taken after the sky had cleared in November of 1979. Beautiful example of the St. Petersburg Baroque, because Kiev as a regional capital was meant to resemble the reigning architectural styles of the Russian Empire in St. Petersburg. Here is a detail of that superb building, Church of St. Andrew. And then we go to Chernihiv. Chernihiv's been much in the news. It's to the north of Kiev. It's virtually surrounded now. This is one of the oldest cathedrals in the area. It is a contemporary of the St. Sophia Cathedral in Kiev. It is a cathedral dedicated to the transfiguration of the Savior in Chernihiv. And you've seen bulletins from Chernihiv on the news nightly. It is now surrounded. Once again, you see some of the original brickwork there on the east end, which is where the main apse or altar was, or the church, this delightful church of Saints Boris and Gleb, built approximately a century later, the 12th century, also in Chernihiv. restored after the Second World War to what we think was its original appearance. The walls survived, but the decoration changed. So many of these churches were converted to Catholic churches with a difference in decoration. Or the Church of St. Paraskeva, Piatnica, the patron saint, or patroness, we might say, of the marketplace. Friday was market day, and it's splendidly restored after the Second World War. It had been given a Baroque carapace during the 18th century, now restored to its original early 13th century form, built on the turn of the 13th century. Another superb example in Chernigov of the Cossack Baroque, Church of St. Catherine, built again at the beginning of the 18th century to commemorate the bravery of Ukrainian Cossacks in the capture of the Turkish fortress of Assoc on the Azov Sea. Again, that Ukrainian Baroque style with the projections from a central core and the Baroque decoration of the domes. Priceless example in Chernigov. These are all now battlefield territories. And I'll conclude with a couple of views that I took in May 1972 of Odessa. This is the monument to the founder and planner and first governor of the city, Duke de Richelieu, at the head of the famous Potemkin steps, as are now known. They figure in the Eisenstein movie, Battleship Potemkin, the famous scene of the baby carriage rolling down in chaos after being fired upon by the massed soldiers of Tsarist Russia. And not far away is the superb Odessa Opera House. Late 19th century, Odessa was one of the major cities of the Russian Empire in the latter part of the 19th century. One of Europe's major ports, a central grain port for the export of the bounty of the Ukrainian breadbasket. So that gives you an idea of the range of my photographic work on several different trips to Ukraine. Of course, the focus of my work has been on Russia's architectural heritage. My students are helping me and have helped me for years get together my archive, which is held at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, and the photographic archives. With the student help, we have scanned tens of thousands of images and cataloged them. But Ukraine is also a part of that archive, so that these two cultures complement each other and should coexist. Now, if we move to our map of Europe, let's talk a little bit about the history of this area. The Slavs have existed in what we would call Eastern Europe. If I could now go to the cursor, I think, yes, there it is. All right, Eastern Europe, since perhaps around the 8th century, there was a political entity along the Dnieper River that's known as Rus, ancient Rus, R-U-S. Kiev became its capital. It was at midway on the Dnieper River, the so-called trading route from the Baltic to the Black Seas, or as they said at that time, from the Varangians, the Vikings, to the Greeks. So we see here the Black Sea in the lower right-hand corner, and we also see the Crimean Peninsula. And in the middle, this is an orange blob. If you can't see the cursor, and I admit that it's rather difficult to see, yes, there's the cursor creeping out on the Black Sea, Crimea, the Dnieper River flows into the Black Sea. And on it is, yes, there is Kiev. It leads up to Smolensk in Russia. So on this river route, which forms a link between, the very lucrative link between the Black Sea and the Baltic, we have a strategically placed political entity growing up, but it was not a unified country. There were many principalities. They owed allegiance to the Grand Prince in Kiev, but in fact, they were constantly warring. There was a metropolitan in Kiev, that is the head of the church, the leading prelate. Of course, the patriarch was in Constantinople, but Kiev was the seat of a metropolitanate. It had a metropolitan of Kiev, and therefore it had the loyalty of Orthodox Christians throughout this vast territory. Now, at the beginning of the 12th century, Kievan princes began to strike out to the northeast, move to fertile lands and forests, seeking to extend their territory. And one of the leaders in that movement was Vladimir II, Vladimir Monomach, or Monomachus, who had married into the Byzantine royal dynasty, family. And so he's established a town which he modestly named after himself, Vladimir, at the what is now northeast of Moscow, and it flourished. Now, during the 12th century, the middle of the 12th century, the 1150s, there was another feud to establish who would be the Grand Prince in Kiev. Eventually, that was won 2 years before his death by Yuri Dolgorukhy. He was considered the founder of a little fortress known as Moscow. But his son, Andrei Bogolyubsky, who had grown up in the Vladimir area, had little regard for Kiev. And when he came to power in 1157, he made Vladimir the center. Now, the head of the church was still in Kiev, but Vladimir became the main political fortress. Now, such things existed more or less in the state, the religious authority in Kiev, political authority in the northwest, and you had the city of Novgorod over here, trading with the west, main commercial center of medieval Rus. The breadbasket now was in the area around Vladimir, and Andrei Bogolyubsky and his successors, Sibyl III, and so forth. Now, the cataclysm that changed all of this occurred from 1237 to 1240, the Mongol invasion. A part of the hordes of Genghis Khan, and they swept through the eastern part of Rus, destroyed Vladimir in January 1238, eventually made their way down to Kiev. There are stories that they loved, the leader of the Mongol armies loved Kiev, was very much taken with his experience, and offered to spare it if they would surrender. But in fact, the inhabitants knew other examples of cities that had surrendered without a fight, and then the inhabitants had been massacred. So they decided to fight. The fall of 1240. Eventually, the Mongols battered the walls, came in, and the population, which is generally given around 50,000, is the largest city in this territory, the Eastern Slavs at that period. Most of them were slaughtered. Some of them were enslaved. Apparently, only a couple of thousand survived in terrible slavery. And at that point, Kiev lost all political power. There was nothing else that it had to offer. Political power moved to the Vladimir. In fact, Kiev tried to rebuild, and in 1299, it was again devastated by warring Tatar Mongol factions. And at that point, the metropolitan Kiev, 1299, moves to Vladimir. He can't take the destruction anymore. So the head of the church is now in Vladimir. But the Principality of Moscow is growing during this period, during the 13th century, the 14th century. In 1320s, they enticed the Metropolitan Vladimir to Moscow, a fateful move in history, because that cements the alliance between the Orthodox Church that would that would take the, yes, if we see the map, I see it. I hope you do.
People cannot see it. People cannot see that.
We have a little technical difficulty. But anyway, the historical narrative that you see still holds. And I'll continue with that narrative as we're trying to find the map. Yes, here it is. I hope you can all see it now. So I'm just a pawn here in the middle of technology. But here you see Ukraine. Here you see the Black Sea. Here you see the Crimea, Kiev, Vladimir is up here to the right, Novgorod and St. Petersburg to the left. All right, now, so let's continue with our narrative. We now have the church moving up here. What happens to Kiev? It is taken over by an entity known as the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which would later ally with Poland. So you have Poland - Lithuania. And this would be the major power in this area during the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. But it was constantly under the threat of attack Crimean Tartars. Here you see Crimea, the Crimean Tartars. And they would periodically rush through this area on slave raids in 15th and 16th centuries to be sold at the slave market in Constantinople. So that Kiev now is just a minor outpost of a few thousand people, with some of its great cathedrals still standing, but little else. A very pale reflection of what it had been before the Mongol invasion. In fact, it did not regain its pre-Mongol population until the middle of the 19th century. So it is an outpost of competing political states, the Ottomans and their vassals, the Crimean Tartars, the Russians to the east, Muscovite Russia, and Poland, Lithuania. Here you see Poland, and there the blue is Belarus. We'll call that part of Lithuania. Lithuania right here is there. At one point, Poland, Lithuania was the main state of Eastern Europe, but they fought with Moscow. Now, in 1599, the Orthodox of this region decide to accept the authority of the Pope, the so-called Union of Lublin. But that irritated many other Orthodox believers among the peasants and among the Cossacks. Now, who were the Cossacks? They were freebooters, they were escaped serfs, people who fled to the periphery of the Tsarist regime. And finally, rather than continually fight, they said, all right, if you preserve our borders, we will give you freedom. So they were the front line in the fight against the Crimean Tartars, but they were Orthodox and they resented Polish overlordship because the Poles were Catholic. So we have again another one of those fundamental dividing lines. Catholic, Orthodox, these divisions remain and continue to divide much of the cultural counterpoint that we see in this part of Europe today. So there was an uprising against the Poles on the part of a Cossack leader, Bogdan Khmelnytsky. And he allied with the Tartars to attack Poland, and he was successful. And during his raid, he pushed the Poles back, but he also slaughtered tens of thousands of Jews. Jews had been invited to Poland when they were driven out of other parts of Europe, such as Spain and Germany. They were invited to Poland, but they were restricted in where they lived. And they were to be the managers of the estates of the Polish nobility, so that the wrath of the peasants was often directed toward Jewish population in this area, as well as against the Polish nobility. These people were innocent. They were killed by the tens of thousands during the Khmelnytsky revolt. And yet, Khmelnytsky is considered a Ukrainian hero. You see his statue in the center of Kiev, a part of the complicated, tragic history of this region. Then Khmelnytsky approaches Moscow, and in 1654, in the Treaty of Yaslav, he accepts Moscow's authority. And 300 years later, in commemoration of that acceptance of Moscow authorities, the Politburo of the Soviet Union would award Crimea to the Ukraine, formerly been a part of the Russian Federated Soviet Republic. We'll get back to that a little bit later. So, Ukraine, left bank Ukraine, so-called because it's on the left bank of the Dnieper River, which goes south into the Black Sea. You see the Black Sea is that blue space over here to the right. The cursor would be so good if we could see it better, but you get an idea. All right. So left bank Ukraine comes under the authority of Moscow. And then in 1667, Moscow and Poland, or Poland-Lithuania, signed a treaty which gives Moscow Kiev and the territory right around Kiev on the right bank of the Dnieper River. So that sets up an enduring dichotomy between the eastern part of this territory, which became known as Ukraine, that is the edge of Muscovite terrain, and the western part, which is still allied with Poland. Partition of Poland from 1773 to 1792, 3 partitions between Prussia, Austro-Hungary, and Russian empires, eliminates Poland from the map. And at that point, Russia obtains majority of its Jewish population, and they are required to stay in so-called Pale of Settlement, where they had lived in what had been the eastern part of Poland and now the territory of Belarus. So you have that component. 1589, Moscow achieves the status of Patriarchate of the Russian Orthodox Church. In other words, it becomes independent of Constantinople, which of course had fallen to the Turks in 1453. So you see this continual realignment of boundaries, of political centers, of religious centers of authority. But Kiev is on the periphery. After so many cataclysms. And yet there was a sense of Ukrainian identity, particularly in the 19th century. Although the Russian Empire forbade the teaching of Ukrainian in the 19th century in schools, nonetheless, there was a Ukrainian literature, writers, poetry, and it was preserved among the people. When do we have this divergence of languages from Ukrainian and Belarusian and Russian? After the Mongol invasion, the languages began to diversify and become independent phenomena. So we've had a great deal of material to talk about here. And you can see how Ukraine has been at the center of warring empires with often tragic consequences for the peoples who lived there, including the Jewish population. Of course, the 20th century brings this again to the fore. The Russian Civil War, the proclamation of a Ukrainian state in 1918, the attempt to define and defend that state, which was then absorbed into the Soviet Union in the beginning of the 1920s. The massacre of the Jewish population during the Russian Civil War, but then the far greater cataclysm of World War II. Well, that history is something that would take us very far from our topic this evening, but it still lingers. Who was guilty and who saved the world from the scourge of Nazi annihilation. These are very deeply emotional, felt emotional issues, as you know. And the current accusation of Ukraine being a center of Nazis, of course, is a canard. Not only do they have a Jewish president, but they have Jewish communities, as does Russia. Russia now has a small but flourishing Jewish community. In Moscow, there is, for example, a superb museum. The Jewish Museum in Moscow is one of the best museums in Russia. It was built with the help, or it was furnished with the help of Western and Russian donors, some of the oligarchs we hear so much about. And if you go to the Jewish, on Wikipedia, the Jewish Community Center at Marina Rossa, you will see photographs taken in 2000 of Vladimir Putin, who was at the opening of that synagogue and Jewish Community Center, Marina Rossa, Marinarosscha, synagogue and community center. He was there. In fact, there's even a photograph of him lighting a menorah candle at the time of Hanukkah. Well, that was 22 years ago. He has also made a point of congratulating the Muslim population on the occasion of Ramadan. After all, Russia is, in its constitution, a multi-confessional state. And then suddenly, we now have this nationalistic fervor. It's linked to the Russian Orthodox Church. Russian Orthodox Church is a very complicated spiritual entity, and it is being used now, one might say complicit, in the terrible events that are unfolding as I speak. So that all of these various political, religious, cultural positions are suddenly at war with each other rather than coexisting as they could have and should have. What is the prospect for the future? I'm not a political scientist, as I told you at the beginning. I have made, as my students recently have calculated, going through my archive, since the summer of 1970, I have made 157 trips to Russia. I have lived there almost a total of 16 years. I have observed things. I continue to have friends there. The conversations we have will stay with me. I don't want to risk anybody else's existence. It is a very difficult time, tragically difficult. And yet many of the people who would reach out to us are being enclosed, partly by our sanctions. But beware the law of unintended consequences. Of course, there is a need to apply sanctions. But in a way, those sanctions, in certain ways, are doing that regime's work for it. They are enclosing the Russian people who have reached out to the West, people who are not suspicious, who greet Western culture, who love Western culture. They are being enclosed. How to resolve that, I cannot answer. But it is something to consider. The law of unintended consequences. The future. You know as much about this as I do. You read the newspaper, you watch the news. It seems to me that things are not going to change anytime soon. For all of the hopes for a truce or some sort of agreement, I don't see the motivation for that at this point. It seems to me the Russian forces are going to try to consolidate gains, increase gains along the periphery in the south and the east. And they have no incentive to achieve a major truce. Yes, the sanctions hurt, but the elite is not hurt by those sanctions. In fact, it probably welcomes them. Let's turn Russia away from these global connections. Earn Russia back in on its great strength. So I see little incentive for major change. I hope I'm wrong. But it seems to me that we'll have a stalemate, perhaps a ceasefire, perhaps not. Perhaps missiles will continue to fly from entrenched positions. And if the Russians are looking at our political, after all, we have elections coming up this year. Now, both the Democratic and Republican parties seem to be united in opposing the invasion. But their perspectives on that are quite different, as you know. And I would imagine the Russians would think anything that undermines the current administration in Washington will be in their favor. And this is not to mention the elections of 2024, the great question marks there. So there is an incentive, in some sense, for the Russians to hunker down, not to create a genuine treaty. Again, I hope I'm wrong, but I see, soberly looking at the situation, I am not sanguine about the possibilities of a constructive resolution. I think any hopes of a Chinese brokered peace are misplaced. But at the moment, the various powers, Turkey, Israel, China, are all seen as players in an attempt to resolve the tragedy that is going on now. My view is we will not see a substantive change for the better in the near future. As for a change toward the worst, I don't want to even think about that. You, I'm sure, have your opinions, the same source of information that I have. I can only give you what I feel will happen later, over the ensuing months of this year. And I can wish and hope for assistance and support to the Ukrainian refugees who have been displaced, that they will have the care that they need. It's a terrible situation. Innocent people caught in this maelstrom. I can only wish and hope for their sustenance, for their continued existence, preservation of Ukrainian culture. Thank you very much. Now I'll entertain your questions.
Thank you, Professor Brumfield. That was really fascinating. We have a lot of questions in the chat, so I'm going to just start running at them. We have a lot of questions about sort of the distinction of the Russian language from the Ukrainian language, and if that sort of has affected the relationship, and are they similar? Do they seem very distinct?
No, they're very similar. As I said, the division of languages into Russian, Belarusian, Ukrainian really begins after the cataclysm of the Tatar invasion, the Mongol invasion, excuse me. The Russians call them Tatars. The Mongol invasion of 1237 and 1240, which really isolates Kiev and fragments the entire area that had been Kiev and Rus, or US, remember, this is pre-Mongol. So that different linguistic variations develop beyond dialectical level. They develop into specific languages. They are very close. All three languages, the East Slavic languages, Belarusian, Ukrainian, and Russian, are written in the Cyrillic alphabet. And there are many cognates. Although I have never studied Ukrainian, I can take a book on architectural history, which is a topic I know, and I can pretty much freely read the book because it's a topic that I know something about. So that shows you how close the languages are. Now, we know that the president of Ukraine is fluent both in Russian and Ukrainian. He recently gave a held a news conference with 4 Russian reporters that was entirely in Russian. In fact, he probably had a command of Russian before he mastered Ukrainian. So there are many people in Ukraine. In the eastern part of the country, they're primarily Russian speakers as you move toward the Russian border. But language is something I think Russians had objected to the fact that there was an overtly pro-Ukrainian language position being promulgated, and why not? After all, it's an independent country. But those things can be negotiated so that the rights Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers and the many people in between can all be protected. So language should not be an obstacle to peaceful coexistence.
Excellent, thank you. Somebody asked, is Belarus culturally more similar to Russia or Ukraine?
I would say that it really, again, is its own entity, but it too, because it had a smaller population than Ukraine did, it didn't have the vibrance of the great cities such as Odessa and Kiev. The center was Minsk. It was a little bit less, shall we say, developed in terms of its cultural position. Now, some might disagree with me on that, but I think that's an objective opinion. So that Belarus has been shall we say, not in the position that Ukraine was, of having a sense of national identity and pride. But again, I don't want to in any way speak against the Belarusian Russian people, who are now also in a complicated situation, but clearly they have been amalgamated into the Russian state. As to whether they are really that similar, I think it depends on who you're talking to and what their position is. But they all should be living in peace. The political aspects, the geopolitical aspects are being utilized, particularly, I think, by Russian intellectuals, a certain group of Russian intellectuals, to say this is what should be. And that is not the best formula or approach for harmonious existence. These are enormously volatile and emotional issues. The people in Russia say the West is destroying our values. And we will not let Belarus and Ukraine become a conduit for that destruction. But it seems to me improbable that war will resolve any of this. Quite the contrary.
Well, and we've had a number of questions about sort of what comes next. Do you think this will eventually lead to Putin invading another NATO state? So people ask specifically about sort of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and the expansion of the country of Russia, the Federation of Russia, Russian Federation. Do you think that's what Putin's end goal is and what he's trying to accomplish?
I think he is keeping all of those options very much to himself, and I have no inside track. I'm sure the people who are watching our broadcast tonight, and I hope you were able to follow my historical narrative even without the map at the beginning. But I think that you follow the news, as do I. So the chances of invading a NATO country, the things are very, very volatile now. I'd like to say that that is improbable. But what does that opinion mean? I really can't read that situation. I can only say what I anticipate for the next several months, which I outlined for you a few minutes ago. The army has had its problems. The Russian army has had its problems. And I think they're going to try to push and at the same time dig in so that any further encroachment on any other territories now seems very remote indeed. Indeed, they tried to broker a peace between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Now their main forces are in Ukraine. And what happens? The Azerbaijanis come into territory that last year the Russians were supposed to be peacekeepers for. So all of these countries on the periphery have their agendas. And it seems to me unlikely that Russia at this point is going to take on a further risky operations.
We've also had a number of questions about sort of the role that religions play in this. So, you know, what are the religious differences between Ukraine and Russia, how they interface with the government, and also somebody had asked specifically about the Russian Orthodox Church and if it was split leading up to this war.
Fine. Well, as I mentioned, the Union of Lublin in 1599 created in the western part of the territory we now call Ukraine, what are called uniates, because they accepted the Union, originally enunciated in the Council of Florence in the 1430s. That is an attempt to take in Eastern liturgy congregations into the Catholic fold. In other words, these Eastern Rite believers in their liturgy would acknowledge the authority of the Pope in Rome. So you have the Uniates, and they were particularly oppressed during the Soviet period, when all religions were oppressed, but the Uniates especially, particularly after the Second World War, when there was a limited rapprochement between the Soviet government and the Russian Orthodox Church, the Moscow Patriarchate. Then you have, after the revolution, there was a self-declared autocephalous Ukrainian Orthodox Church. They refused to accept the authority of the Moscow Patriarchate because it was in a Bolshevik-controlled, communist-controlled country. And then you had Ukrainian churches, Ukrainian Orthodox, that still owed their loyalty to the Patriarch in Moscow. So essentially you had three groups. And during the occupation, Second World War, these groups were set against each other. It's a very complicated story. And in this country, you would have various Ukrainian dioceses that would pay owe their allegiance to these competing factions. The autocephalous Ukrainian Church, the Ukrainian Church allied with or associated with the Moscow Patriarchate, and the Uniates, as I mentioned. Now, I've been told now that a number of Ukrainian parishes that were formerly affiliated with the Moscow Patriarchate are moving away from that relationship. They are disappointed that the church in Moscow has not condemned the invasion and the chaos that is created. So that essentially is the position. But remember, you have a reconstituted Jewish community in Ukraine, in Odessa, and Kiev, and other cities, having been virtually annihilated during the Second World War. People have been evacuated, they returned to Ukraine and reconstituted, open synagogues. And you have this community, as you have a reconstituted community in Moscow and in Germany itself. So that also is an important factor. And then you have the Crimean Tatars, who are Muslims. So that there is a Muslim population there as well. All of these people should be able to coexist. There is no reason why they cannot. And in many ways, they've been able to. Religion should not be a weapon in this conflict. It doesn't need to be. There are different religions, as I've outlined, in the territory of Ukraine, but this does not need to be a reason for animosity.
So we have time for just one more question. People want to know, what do you think of the job that President Zelensky is doing, and how will people remember this in the future?
Well, again, in this particular case, I'm a cultural historian. I know what you know. I see what you see. And clearly he has handled the situation to a degree with a skill that few people could have predicted. Now, I think he was underestimated. And as for any further comment, I would defer to the knowledge of your many listeners, alumni, of which I am one. And I'd just like to, again, in concluding, take this opportunity to express my gratitude to so many years of Tulane students, men and women, who have provided such enormous help in my project, my archival project, my documentary project, which deals with Ukraine and Russia. I am enormously indebted to Tulane students, and we're all a part of that great body.
Well, thank you so much. That was really fascinating and really thoughtful about how to think about this crazy time that we're in right now. And in appreciation of your former Tulane students, we have 4 lucky winners of copies of your book, Architecture at the End of the Earth. And those people are Carter Fleming, Robert Hinckley, Ken Sadowski, Margaret Walker, and Nancy Weiner. So our staff will be in touch soon to get those out to you. But for everybody else, thank you for joining us tonight. We hope you can join us in our next faculty lecture. Please visit the Tulane Alumni Association website for a recording of this lecture and more information about alumni events, both in New Orleans, online, and near you at home. Thank you again, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.